Hello, hello, everyone. Vibing to my music. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have you. I see some people are already joining in. That's amazing. Hello, everyone. Founders, investors, startup operators everywhere. Welcome to episode 5 of Doing Business in Africa series. Can't believe we're in episode 5 already. Just feels like yesterday we started and had the pilot, and it's been an amazing journey so far. So, the Doing Business in Africa series, we curate the most valuable conversation about brilliant operators and their experiences building business in Africa. At the end of each episode, you'd have learned something new about the African business landscape from the founders, investors, policymakers, and operators that are building businesses on the continent. This series is brought to you by Itana, Africa's first special economic zone for digital and service based business. Itana is the ideal jurisdiction for businesses that are seeking a more enabling environment to do business and scale. And you can head off to app.itana.africa to get started, to set up a new business entity, or to set up a subsidiary, or just access some of the supports that we have. Today's session is focused on the topic understanding Africa's real economic potential through data and not hype. I'm very excited about this topic because Africa is always in the news for different things, and people need data to make smart decisions. So we said, you know what, let's discuss this. Let's really break down what the data says and what is reality, and let's get the experts in the room to have this conversation. So today we have three incredible speakers who are experts in their field, and they'll be sharing their insights on the topic. So I hope you have your pen and notebooks ready, and you have your questions as well as you're joining the conversation. So today we have Preston Ideh, the CEO of Stears. We have Abdulrahim, COO of Steers, and Dr. Andrew Nevin, who is a research professor and economist. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello, nice to have you all
Hi,
here.
good afternoon. Great to be here.
I'm realizing that everyone is wearing black. It's just me. I missed the dress code slightly.
Yeah, we had a meeting earlier to
I
discuss
figured,
health.
I figured you had a meeting behind my back. Yeah, no worries, no worries. I would love to kick off with intros. I did very surface level introduction, but I want everyone in the room to know who you are because you guys are the experts. I feel that this conversation is one that they would have had to pay thousands of dollars to get access to, and here we are just giving it out for free. So I'd love to get introductions. So Preston, Abdul, and then Andrew. Let's have the intros.
Okay, I guess since you called my name first, I would just go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Preston Ideh, co-founder and CEO at Stears. Stears, we're a financial data and software company. I'm focused on making data available to fund managers, to service providers, and corporates, particularly data to support the investment decision process. So think about your sort of due diligence when you want to understand the business, want to understand the market, want to understand an opportunity so that you can get the best return out of it. In terms of my background, um, started off as a lawyer actually before finding my way to data. So I was worked in structured finance, project finance, leverage finance, and then sort of migrated back to Lagos from London and have been building stairs ever since. So I know we'll get into it a bit more, but I'm glad to be here and looking forward to sharing more about data. Thank you.
Great. Maybe I can go next. Hi, everyone. Abdul. I am co-founder and COO of Steers. So work very closely with Preston for the last 5 or so years. So I head up our intelligence team, which is a team that produces a lot of the research and data that goes into the platform that Preston mentioned to support our private capital customers who are looking at deploying capital on the continent in Africa. Background wise, I've weaved and wound in the last decade of my life. So unlike Preston, I started off as a philosopher and economist, and then became a corporate lawyer in private equity M&A. And then lightning struck, and I decided that maybe technology was the future. So I decided to do a PhD in computer science, which I did not complete. So no one needs to call me doctor. But yeah, in my history, I've kind of bopped around many different disciplines. But I think it's been particularly useful for the journey of an entrepreneur because you kind of have a very wide skill or toolbox to use for various situations that we tend to face as entrepreneurs, particularly on the continent. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. It's not too late to complete that PhD. Andrew?
Thank you, Nkechi, Preston, Abdul. So my name is Andrew Nevin. I am speaking to you from Dallas, Texas. I'm a research professor at the Center for Brain Health, which is a neuroscience center at the University of Texas at Dallas. You can see from my virtual background, there's something special there. That is what you might think it is. Those are glass neurons. So there's 200 glass neurons in this special room in the Center for Brain Health, and they actually have the gray matter and the white matter that kind of make your brain actually work. So, but the reason I'm with you today was I spent from 2008 to 2023 in Nigeria, where I was with PwC. I led the strategy group, the financial services group, and was also chief economist on that. I lived in Nigeria for longer than any other place as an adult. Very connected to the startup scene there and a number of companies that I either continue to advise or have very small investments in as an angel investor. I wrote a book called Self-Organizing Nigeria or Self-Organizing Niger that talks about all the incredible things happening in Nigeria that we don't necessarily hear about, with 6 authors in total, one of whom was Rufai Oseni, who of course is the very famous journalist from Arise. So Nigeria in Africa is in my blood. I was actually born in South Africa, though I'm Canadian on that. And I really miss, after 15 years in Africa, I really miss it, but very happy to be part of it and excited about our session today.
Awesome. This is a wonderful intro. I'm so humbled to be moderating this session. And I hope everyone has wicked questions for you guys. So all those questions that you've been wondering who would answer it, this is where to bring it. Whatever it is, if you want to know the future of Africa, I don't know, they probably could tell you in detail. But great, it's awesome to have you guys here. Welcome. I always like to start with a very warm question that before we get into the meat of it, and I want everyone to participate. So if you're watching in, I want you to actually join in this question. So this is the question. If you could go back in time to witness any historic event, which event would you want to go and witness? And we will start in the same order. Preston, Abdul, Andrew, and everyone that is watching in, please let us know in the comments. I want to see what historic events you would like to witness.
Okay, that's a good one. Well, I mean, I don't want to be boring now because the one that always comes to mind is a little boring. But honestly speaking, I would love to have seen Nigeria's independence day in particular, and the reason is very simple. When you look back now, it's like, people say we haven't achieved everything we could have set out to achieve in the beginning. But if I could go back to that beginning and just get a sense of, what's the energy like? What were people's hopes? Did people expect us to be further than we are? Further back, all of that just is quite interesting for me. So Independence Day is my number one. I wouldn't share my number two, but I would say Nigeria's Independence Day. That is a event I wish I could have been a part of.
Interesting. I've never guessed it, honestly. Abdul, what's yours?
Yeah, no, Preston's a politics buff. I think in his other life, he might have become a politician if, Stears did not come in his purview. For me, it is actually maybe not as interesting because actually I feel like I am living through the time I actually want to be in right now, which is essentially the advancement of technology becoming more intelligent. I think for me, when I started my postgrad, it was always this like kind of theoretical concept that you discussed in like, whether computers can actually be very intelligent and like what could they do. But I feel like today we're living through the actual beginnings of that. And yeah, I wouldn't change it for anything.
You're the politician in the group, actually. Because it has been revealed. Andrew, which is your answer?
Well, let me just start saying I'm a little bit with Abdul. I mean, I'm obviously old. I mean, the reason I left Nigeria was I was forcibly retired from PwC, which is not a bad thing. I'm not critical of PwC. You knew that the day you were joined, and I'm happier for younger people to take over. So I'm not that young. I mean, I did my university in the 70s. But to what Abdul said, the reason I want to keep living is I want to see how it all turns out, how AI turns out, how Africa turns out, how climate change turns out, for better or for worse. But in fact, what I would love to see historically is something go back a little bit further. I'd love to go back 50,000 years to the Rift Valley in Ethiopia at the beginning of Homo sapiens and their development, and just spend a few days watching Homo sapiens at that point, who were equally intelligent to the people now, and just kind of think about that incredible chain that connected what was happening at the Rift Valley to what we see on the planet with the technology today. And of course, I work at a neuroscience center, so very interested in the brain. As I said, the brain of Homo sapien 50,000 years ago is identical in kind of its capabilities as the brains we have today. So that's what I would like to see.
Awesome. That's really amazing. That's amazing. There's some responses that have come in. Um, Yele says he wants to see the hand of God in Argentina versus England in 1986. That's definitely one to see. Mayowa says he wants to see him being born. So he said giving birth to me. I guess that's a historic
Ah,
event. Rejoice says the same thing, that he would like to witness his birth because he sees that as a historic event. Chukwuka says like to witness Nigeria's music scene in the 70s. Ooh, that's
oh.
nice. Ayodeji says wants to witness either the moon landing or the extinction of dinosaurs. Honestly, I think that's where I would go. I would want to go so far back to just understand prehistoric time. Um, Akin is with you, Preston. Love to witness Nigeria's independence as well. Gabriel would like to see the Wright brothers on their first flight. That would be
Mm.
pretty cool. So amazing. Okay,
Yeah,
so now we've
very
gone to
broad
the past.
answers.
Very broad answers. Yours is that you want to stay in the now. So
I love now.
I love now. So we've gotten to go back in time and seen some history. So now let's get down to the data. And I know people love data because they like to predict the future. They like to look at trends and use that to predict the future. I don't know, I think it's Preston. This is your tag somewhere where you say, in God we trust. Every other person should bring data. So let's get down to the data of it, right? And please, as we go along, put your questions in the comments. There's some questions that were sent in earlier. We'll start with those, and then if you have any questions, let's put it in the comments. So, Preston, when you talk about Africa's economic potential, which it's always in the news, and everyone is trying to figure Africa out and how they would like to participate in the continent in some form, right? What specific data points should we be looking at, and what do they actually tell us?
Yeah. So I think I haven't been through enough, because long term, I'll say economic cycles, across Africa to have a very rich opinion based on my own experience. But the one thing I do tend to lean towards is actually investment data, and specifically more I guess you could say exit data. So these are successful investments where the money has been deployed and money has been returned. That would be my sort of focus to understand sort of any market. And the reason I say this is, well, when it comes to potential, we tend to think about potential from the lens of, where are we today and where can we be in, say, 10 years or 20 years. And I think that has been the African narrative around potential, which is why we're always regarded as that continent with so much potential, right? But I think that from a data perspective, you want to add a sort of caveat to that and narrow it down a bit. And I think the additional layer I would bring to that is doing a sort of weighting based on likelihood of actual outcomes. So, for instance, you could say that take some like population growth, right? You could say Africa will have X population by 2030 or by 2050, right? If you layer on top, the likelihood of that happening, right? So our growth rate is going to stay the same, all of that actually going to pan out as we expect. I think you form a different view, a more informed view of potential and understanding potential, right? And the second thing I would say, also using that same, that sort of same lens, if you say, an industry is worth, I'll just keep this generic, say $100 billion, and it could be, at 200 billion in 10 years, right? The more informative way that I think to look at that is, what's the likelihood of that happening, right? Is that your base case? Is that your sort of worst case? Is that your best case? Because if you're an investor trying to deploy, then you probably don't want to invest all the time necessarily on the best case scenario. You want to think about, where is this market actually going to be? And I think that the data around investments, successful return on investment, is a data point to track. I know it's quite difficult for many people to see that kind of data, and what do returns look like across different industries. But if you actually troll through African data, look at different opportunities across different asset classes, you will see really, really incredible investment opportunity that have been taken, and money has been made in return. So, capital has been returned to LPs or to original investors, and doubling down on those opportunities, I think, is a very, very solid way to keep building, where, without just the fancy belief, but actually building where you have concrete evidence of past success that can lead to future success. So yeah, investment data is what I would say. Transactions, deals, all of that across multiple asset classes.
That's really interesting, right? Because I feel that when people look at Africa, that data is, it's, people see it as secondary, maybe because it's not as available, and that's why steers exist, because this is very important data. People would usually look at GDP, inflation. Those are like the ones that are always in the news. But you've talked about something that is really, really important, and I feel that people need access to, because that is, you're following the money. Right? Most people, when they look at the opportunity in Africa, they're thinking, what's the economic, in terms of financial terms, opportunity for them? And you guys are actually following the money, which is interesting. But that's very, very important data. Now, Andrew, how do macroeconomic indicators, like the regular, like the GDP growth, inflation, or population trends, vary across African markets? And how should founders or investors interpret these differences?
Yeah, so when I was chief economist at PwC Nigeria, I mean, we never published forecasts. I mean, other people were publishing forecasts, and we were very clear for a number of reasons. I mean, one, if we're publishing a forecast, it's essentially saying this is how we think the future will turn out. I mean, the future is highly uncertain everywhere around the world, but particularly in our environment in Africa. But the other reason for it was because we weren't trying to predict the future; we were trying to create the future. And I guess my thinking for entrepreneurs is, you need to look beyond these kind of simple GDP numbers. So people sit in New York, and they sit in London, or they sit in Dubai. They're comparing countries and the fastest growth rate, et cetera. But the companies that I think are most successful are the ones that dig a lot deeper. And I'll give you, one example that really struck me when I was in Nigeria. I went to visit with a new CEO of one of the big cement companies, and he was an expat, and he started to travel around the country, and he was trying to reconcile what he was getting from the headline GDP numbers and the headline average income per capita with what he was seeing in places outside of Lagos, outside of Abuja. People were buying cement. So there was a disconnect between what this data would tell you, this kind of official data would tell you, and what was actually happening on the ground. And I think every time you kind of dig in Africa, you find that's the case, that there's more purchasing power than you think, there's more economic activity than you think. Another example, I mean, there was all this discussion went on with the AFCFTA about integration. It turned out there was more informal trade between African countries than formal trade that was captured. But even more importantly, it turned out that the informal trade, so trade that was not captured in the data, was higher value added goods. So not the simple goods, not just agricultural goods, but more tending toward manufacture, higher end services on that. So that tells you, I think, and this is why Steers is so important, that tells you that you need to dig beyond whether South Africa is growing at 2% or 4%, or Kenya is growing at 6%, or Rwanda is growing at 8% on that, to what's actually happening in your industry specifically. And of course, most of the companies that I've seen to be successful, who have a kind of trying to do new things in Africa, they're not fulfilling an existing market need. They're in a sense creating the market. They're creating a new structure that allows things to unlock. And there's a lot more energy and a lot more resources and a lot more money and a lot more purchasing power than sometimes these official statistics give. So I don't think you can solve any of these I don't think you can build a business sitting in New York or sitting in Tokyo in Africa. I think you have to come to the ground, understand the specificities, get numbers on the ground, get data from other sources than the official statistics on that tell you kind of what's the activity level and then what's the potential activity level.
Absolutely, I agree. And I do agree with you need to experience it, right? You need to experience it firsthand to be able to get it and to be able to understand the nuances. And people tend to feel, just looking at Nigeria as a country, Lagos and Abuja are so different and they are within the same country. And if you were to build a solution that you feel it works in Lagos, is going to just copy and paste will work in Abuja, it will be surprising that it wouldn't because there's such nuances that you would have to experience. So that's really amazing point. Abdul, when you look at all the stories that are being said about Africa, where do the global narratives about Africa, where do they get it wrong? And what does the data reveal that is often overlooked?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. I think actually from what Preston and Andrew have said, they're kind of, already touching on some of the issues or the disconnect, I would say. I think I tend to see sort of a couple of disconnects when the global narrative is talking about Africa. Obviously, I haven't lived so long on this earth, but I would say one of the things that many of us will be familiar with is the disconnect on the hype and reality around Africa, which is basically that we tend to see the swing between Africa rising and then also the hopeless continent. So I think there was a period in the early 2010s maybe where there was a big return drive and I guess return home drive by a lot of African diaspora because obviously Africa was rising. It was the boom. I think it was also around the same time the BRICS was sort of like coined and essentially everyone was super interested and thought it was like, Africa was going to be the future. And then you fast forward again and then it's like, after after an economic cycle, everyone sort of gets a bit pessimistic and it's like, it starts to seem like, there is not a lot of opportunity for growth on the continent. And I think what that does is oversimplifies the diverse continent. And I think similar to what Andrew was saying is that if you took sort of Europe as a continent, there are countries that are in their growth cycle, there are sectors that are doing particularly well. And on the flip side of that, there are also sectors that may be going through a down cycle and also in a churn or like in a refresh. So I think that kind of brings us back to the point of essentially diving a bit deeper into actually what is going on at a more granular level than just the high level Africa rising stereotypes. And I think, for instance, obviously one that we often hear is the talent potential in Africa and how it's obviously often overlooked. Now, the fact, for instance, is that actually, if you look at Nigeria on its own, it has more tech developers than Sweden. Now, it might not feel that way because most developers in Nigeria are probably not working for Nigerian companies, but in reality, the talent actually exists there. But again, it's not something that is in nuances captured in the narrative around like, okay, Africa has big demographics and potential. The other one is just generally, I think, when it comes to investment, the risk perception versus the actual data also has quite a big disconnect. I think many narratives, when you speak to investors who, like Andrew said, have never been to Africa and are just looking at GDP statistics on their computer from the World Bank, IMF, and using that to sort of chart where their next investment trend or investment sort of check goes, those tend to overstate the risk because they lack the context. And I like to think essentially of risk as a proxy for unfamiliarity. So when something is unfamiliar, you just by default, and I think it's a human thing, consider it sort of just too risky. And this is obviously where better data kind of reveals that sort of several African countries are actually, operating sort of stable economies, have grown quite, drastically. I think even if you look at the Francophone region, the emergence of fintech, even Cote d'Ivoire as a new hub as well, emerging over the last few years. And I think when we start to sort of dig a bit deeper to get better data on what is actually happening, I guess, in the real economy, we start to close that gap between the perception and the reality when it comes to risk in Africa.
That's really, really insightful. And you just mentioned Francophone countries, which is interesting because I feel that they are very misunderstood. And maybe that's also me being unaware of some of the economic potential there. I had a colleague that was from, I think it was from Niger or one of those countries that are above us, and it's a francophone country. He was building a startup there, And he kept talking about how we needed to understand the market better and there's great opportunities there. And it felt like a black hole in my mind. You know, when someone tells you something and you have nothing to anchor it with, like you have no idea how or what's going on there. And this is me within Africa, right? So I think being able to have access to this information and seeing across like the different nuances that exist is really, really
Yeah,
important. There's a comment
exactly.
here
And
from
I was even just going to, I was just even going to add that I think with Francophone, what obviously the language is the key barrier. By default, there are more English speakers in African than there are Francophone or French speakers.
yeah,
So it tends to cancel out a lot of the information that you would ordinarily want to get on what's actually going
yes.
on in that side of the continent.
Yes, yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. I still don't know how Nigeria managed to not be bilingual. Like we don't have maybe somewhere up north, but not enough French at all.
Maybe if
There,
Preston was at the independence, it would have helped.
exactly, exactly. He would have made it so. There's a question here from Yele. He says that how can you narrow that gap? I think he's talking about based on what Andrew has said. Said it sounds like there's a high cost to gathering reliable data by being on the ground and building data streams. Is capital patient enough to gather this relevant data? I feel like it's going to be a mixed answer between Andrew and Preston as well. Because so, Andrew, do you want to comment on that first?
No, I want to hear Preston first before I answer. Preston is Steers, and Steers is trying to solve this problem. So.
No,
And that's why this is why Steers was set up to create data streams that didn't
Yes.
exist.
that's
Yes.
exactly it, right? I think so the first thing to understand about this is, selling data, this is an industry that exists in different parts of the world, right? Europe, North America, there's no reason why we shouldn't have a similar industry in on the continent in Nigeria. I always say that I wish there were more data companies because it would make my life easier, because then everyone wouldn't come to me for every piece of missing data. We'll be able to focus and get a niche and go really, really deep. But I think the key thing to it is actually on the business model level, where yes, collecting data is can be expensive, but it's your ability to
Mhm.
actually spread that cost, right, across multiple users, right, that makes the business out of it. And I say that because the key is understanding the recurring uses of data. So for instance, we ended up focusing on fund managers doing their deal origination and deal evaluation. Because if you're a fund manager, you're definitely always doing that. Right.
Mm.
To deploy, you need to, pull data to make that happen. So it's recurring. It means that if I collect one piece of data, right, I can sell it to multiple people, right? And that cost can be shared across. The challenge tends to be where the data need is very, very niche, and it's effectively cannot be resold to someone else. That's when the cost becomes very high. So we have worked with sort of DFIs who end up having to spend quite a bit because they're the only people looking for that piece of data. But again, even with that, what we find is the more you compound data, right? For data companies, what actually happens is you become more valuable the more data you collect, and the more users you have, the more you can actually collect even more valuable data because you can spread that cost, and spread that cost across. So I don't really think it's I think it's inevitable that we get to that place where data becomes more easily available because, companies like Steers exist and other companies that also want to solve the data problem. But I think, sharing that cost across users, making sure you understand the use cases, and also maybe one thing that might seem a bit controversial, but it's just that, when it comes to value for data, there can be a mismatch between the cost of collecting and what someone's willing to pay. And so
Mm.
the data that will get collected first is data that has a high market value because people want it, and so they're willing to sort of put pounds and not just pennies down to actually get it. So I'll pause it because I know we can talk about data, but I also really want to hear what Andrew as to say from his experience also even getting data.
Yeah, well, I think to begin with, if we could just go to the kind of classic macroeconomic data, I mean, they're lagging indicators and they're collected in a very kind of historic, semi-manual way. What's more interesting in the modern world are things that are being automatically generated by our activities. And the fact that so many activities have come online mean that those data are more and more available. I mean, the obvious thing is your cell phone usage, right? So, and how many people are using minutes and data, and that kind of gives you a very good indication of economic activity in an area. And all of a sudden, you may have Sokoto, you may not think of as having much economic activity, but you can look at this data that's being generated in real time. You don't have to wait for quarterly or annual GDP results for Sokoto, which are not going to be accurate anyway. You're actually seeing what Sokoto people are actually doing. I mean, the other one that is, of course, very good for this is payment data. I mean, as more and more payments go electronic, even for low value transactions in Africa, and the proliferation of different kind of payment systems, the payment data gives you a very good indication, excuse me, of what's happening in real time. So I think those sorts of data sources become much more valuable. And obviously, if you're an entrepreneur and you want to tap into them, you need a partner like Steers or someone else who's kind of processing that data and presenting it in a form, and it's going to cost you something. But that's what the future is. And of course, sometimes the data, just not an example from Africa, but if you think of I mean, I spent 10 years, I said that I lived the longest in Africa as an adult. The second longest place I lived was actually China. I went to China the first time in 1983 and worked there for 10 years later. Not at the time, but when I finished school. And of course, there's a mismatch between the Chinese Communist Party GDP data, which I'm very suspicious of, and the electricity usage data. So there's a relationship between kind of any level of economic development between electricity usage and GDP, and the numbers from GDP don't match the actual electricity. So there are ways to go beyond the GDP, and it has to be in real time. And of course, better than even real time data is data that forward indicators that tell you what's going to happen in the future with economic activity by sector. So that's the future of data, and I think that any investee that relies on kind of classic macroeconomic sectoral data, historic, collected in this manual or semi-manual way, is not doing their business a service.
Yeah. And you mentioned something, you talked about some data that's easily available, the payment data, transaction data. So these ones, I imagine if there's a company that processes payment, they would track all these things. These ones are easily available. But then you talk about data from a woman that is in the village that is carrying out certain economic activity, and that just goes unrecorded. Like you can't really capture that particular data. I feel that a lot of data in Africa are lost that way. Like what we're able to track right now might be, I don't know what percentage it is, but there's a lot of data that we cannot capture because these people are either inaccessible to us, or they don't use tools that captures this data. For those kinds of situation, what's the best way to track it? And I feel like I'm going to throw this at Abdul, because how do you then capture those kinds of data where the person is sort of cut off from the regular systems?
Yeah. No, I actually was thinking as you were speaking, just because you're right. I think even, for instance, the data that we've been able to capture just in terms of financial services, fintech, has actually helped the narrative of the fintech revolution and what it means for the continent. Like, for instance, we know that I think, is it about 65% of global money transactions are done in Africa, not anywhere else in the world. So when you then talk about the inverse, where it's like you're talking low resource, very little information, I think I'll kind of go through maybe sort of what Andrew was pointing out, which is essentially proxy information that helps you get a sense of what's happening in a specific area. And proxy data is not very straightforward because obviously it is a proxy, and it requires a lot of ingenuity to be able to identify kind of what is actually going on in a sort of low resource or uncovered parts of the continent or country. I think some of the smart ways, obviously, we've seen people do this is, for instance, not super accessible, but like satellite imagery data, for instance, can give you a sense of activity in a specific region, even if it's not, covered. Another that we've seen, for instance, is there's still some proxies you can use for consumption, in the sense that if you have like market data, you can sample it and then get a sense of like what the broader area might be. And then I think the other thing that also gives us an interesting proxy is also internet data. So how many people sort of connect, log in are they purchasing sort of like, mobile data to sort of like get access to the internet. It again, it's not a perfect, I guess, replication
Mm.
or view of what's actually happening in those areas, but it gives you a sense of where you might need to point to, and whether there's something interesting there for a business or an investor to sort of dig in further. And I think that's the way I'll think about it, because I think someone flagged in the comments, collecting data at scale is quite expensive, particularly when it's data from people. So what you want to be able to do is essentially use the proxies to help guide you as to where you need to sort of point those resources and essentially go a bit deeper and more granular as well.
Awesome. I think that's really insightful. I feel like you were already getting into a how to get data, and it'd be really useful for some of the founders here that are wondering, I'm building for these people, and I don't even know, I don't have a good idea of how to understand them. So that's really useful. There's an interesting comment here by Kayode, and I'm trying to figure out who I send it to. So Kayode says the new Nigerian budget showed more hype than data forecasting. Forecasting an increase of C 31% in oil production, significant decrease in inflation with no clear pathway to how it's an all-time high budget revenue will be achieved. World Bank also challenged this. Do you think it's good? Fake it to make it. I mean, we're budgeting by grace and by faith, right? And how does this shape the country's outlook to investors? I feel like I'm going to throw this to Preston.
I was gonna say I would love to hear what Andrew thinks about this.
Same here. The real economist who has seen Nigeria.
Because this is a conversation, if you're pure hardcore economist working on economy, right,
Yeah.
the border comes out it's big. So Andrew, sorry to throw it to you, but I'm actually curious.
Andrew's in
Yeah,
Texas, so
yeah,
it's
no.
fine.
So those who saw me in my public role in Nigeria back before I retired. I mean, I stood up for a decade and I said, look, the growth rate should be the headline growth rate. So we've talked about the criticism of of kind of classic macroeconomic indicators, but let's talk about the positives. I mean, 3% is better than 2%, but 6 or 8% is better than 3%. So I stood up time and time again and said, there's something fundamentally wrong here. We should be growing at not 3% or two. Well, it was 2% for some years, and then 3% when I left at the end. It should be 6, 8, 10%. And again, as I said, I lived in China for 10 years, witnessed what the Chinese transformation. When I arrived in 1983, there was not a single private car. 25 years later, they were the largest producer and the largest consumer of automobiles. So I've seen this kind of economic transformation. We all want it for Nigeria. The 31% oil increase. Yeah, I saw that headline the other day. And, again, the last few years, I was talking a lot about oil production, even though we're transitioning out of hydrocarbons. Nigeria in the short or medium term should be rapidly increasing its oil production. Of course, we all had the challenges in Nigeria with the collapse of the exchange rate. I mean, the primary reason for that was the collapse in oil production, and for various reasons that people understand. So I don't disagree with the ambition on the 31%. Again, it's always how to get there, and sometimes we just don't at an aggregate level. The government's not necessarily doing the things that we need to do. I mean, one of the things that I was saying before I left was we should be rapidly increasing gas production, which requires a lot of coordination because it's a little more complex than oil production. I mean, with the invasion of the problems with Russia in Europe and the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, I mean, the last place the Europeans want to be buying gas from is Russia, right? So they want to be buying it from somewhere else. They should have been buying it from Nigeria. I think Nigeria has either the highest or second highest gas reserves in the world. So this is all a long way of saying that I don't mind the ambition. I mean, it's always the blueprint. But again, I also comment on that. The World Bank on that. I mean, I was generally critical of the World Bank and the IMF when I was there. I didn't think they were very helpful. I can't speak for other countries, but living in Nigeria, I just felt that they were kind of part of painting this very kind of negative narrative, and
Yeah.
having them come in and tell us again we can't reach 31%. I mean, we've produced as high as 2.8 million barrels a day, so we can obviously, return to that under the right conditions. So I'm not sure what the objectives of the World Bank are in Nigeria, but I was never a big fan of them, quite frankly.
Awesome. I really like that response. Um, but yeah, I think there is some optimism in the way that it's being painted, like thinking that we'll be able to reach that level of production. But I feel that with the right structures, maybe it's not just being optimistic. Maybe there are some infrastructure being put in place to ensure that we reach that. And I also believe that we need to speak very positively about Nigeria and our continent. I always talk about this. Every country has issues and things that happens behind closed doors, right? But it's all how they tell the story, and we need to do a better job of
Well,
actually telling the story.
sorry to interrupt. Okay, let me just add a little bit of what Abdul said about kind of historical context. I mean, some of the things that we might, from a Nigerian perspective, admire about the West, to the rule of law, which is under siege, but democracy, the economic development. Some countries have a kind of very fair income distribution. I mean, these things developed over 2,000 years, right? I
Yeah,
mean, so you had, or let's say 1,600 years. So you had the fall of the Roman Empire in about 440 AD. And from the period from 440 AD to 1945, the end of the Second World War, I mean, you had constant, warfare challenges, problems in Europe that were, only get gradually resolved. So one of the reasons I loved living in Nigeria was just seeing these things happen in real time. So
yeah,
yeah, I would complain that this year we didn't get our 6% growth rate, still disappointing. But the reality is, the difference I saw between 2008 and now 2025 is extraordinary. And I think
yeah,
Nigeria and Africa as a whole should be celebrating this progress. And there is no narrative to me that says Africa is not going in the right direction. It's clearly going in the right direction. Incredible things are happening in many places across the continent, and they're actually happening at a much. I said, why did I like living in Nigeria? I like living in Nigeria because I got to watch history unfold in real time. If I lived in Europe in those 1,600 years, all I see is this little tiny sliver of things probably going backwards or nowhere. But I got a chance to watch history unfold,
yeah.
so I'm very grateful for that.
Amazing, amazing. I really like that. I really like that. And I think that puts that into context, right? Africa, Nigeria, it's still an infant compared to some of these other nations that have been independent for so many years, and they've done a lot of these work and put some of these structures. And for us, some of our structures were inherited as opposed to being built for the context that we live in. And so we have to do some redesigning the process. And whilst we're doing that, whilst the continent is unfolding and is, coming into its own, I think we need to do a better job of telling our own story, of really helping people see what is happening, because there has been progress. And like you said, you were here in 2008, and just looking now, there has been progress. There have been people that are more connected than they were before. you know Electricity is even better than when I was a kid, right? Like there's been a lot of progress over the years, and we need to be able to highlight that, right? And that's what helps build like faith and trust, to be able to do more, and optimism, which is really, really important. There is another question here. It says, what's the most misinterpreted macro signal in African economies today? I think that's a really good one. Who wants to jump on it?
I can do I guess a quick. This is more of a personal opinion, not for any. I don't have any strong fact to sort of back this, but for me, I always find that GDPs are not particularly very helpful as a representation of growth or size of an economy. I think we
Yeah.
touched on it a bit about things about informal economies not being captured. Even like for instance, the process of calculating GDPs is like exercise that probably only economists and statisticians can understand. So I find that it's not necessarily a good proxy for what is going on in the country. And also the size of the GDP is sometimes maybe not as important as essentially the rate of it as well. So if you're not capturing something in the first instance, I think, smaller economies that by default can grow, pretty fast, might not get the limelight in the sense of thinking as someone who's thinking of opportunities and countries to invest in or like operate in, because you maybe look at the five or the big four or the big five, I guess the number keeps changing in Africa, or the big 10, and
Hmm.
whereas there's obviously a lot more opportunity that could also be taken advantage of when you look beyond the top contenders in terms of size.
Yeah. Yeah, we usually use the GDP, population. They're the usual suspects that people always throw out whenever they are trying to understand the continent. And you're right, they don't tell all the story. They don't. They really don't. Um, Dara Dabere Chuku. I think I'll throw this one at Preston. So she says, for Preston and Abdul, great work with Steers. I have been a fan since 2021. Wow, she's been following you guys for a while. So this is question is for, I'll throw it to Preston. How can we encourage more Africa-centric economic studies to aid the work Steers does? We need more tailored Afrocentric economic research. What do you hear? Economic research other than the one size fits all models for African economies used by international financial institutions. From experience, surely it will be obvious that even two nations in the same region read differently in real macro metrics. So I think the question is how can we encourage more Africa-centric economics studies to aid the work that Steers does?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's actually a very good question, and I think the answer is actually a lot simpler than people might expect. It really needs to be more. It needs to just be more. I'll say locally driven, right? Because there's a sort of depth and understanding to any market, right? That allows you to do much richer analysis. One of my personal sort of challenges, like Andrew mentioned, World Bank, IMF, is sort of their, I guess, their perspective on one hand, from a sort of global world order versus, Nigerian sort of understanding of our own challenges and our own growth path. But I think we have to just encourage ourselves and remind ourselves actually that it's our job to do it, right? To do it first as well. Not necessarily rely on the more sort of global, whether it is data collectors or data platforms or whatever they are to cover our market. I'll give you an example. So in our particular use case where we provide data for investments to to different customers, we find that the default tool that people would use to understand local African market is a global data platform like your Cap IQ or your Bloomberg, your PitchBook or Preqin. Right? These are all just global platforms. Now their coverage of Africa is limited. Right, it's very limited, right? These are not the markets where they're deploying resources to get data. But if that's the only option, and you need to make your decision, you take it because some data is better than no data. The only way people start to really change that pattern is if more sort of local providers can actually produce their own data as equivalent. Because when we're having conversations with customers, we're constantly saying, well, we understand the use cases for which you need data, right? And we're providing it to you, and we're doing this locally. The doing it locally doesn't necessarily mean it has to be African, but it has to be done with an appreciation of the context on ground. I think that is extremely key. I know that what people loved about Stairs from the beginning was the fact that they were getting a certain level of analysis and rigor, right, from sort of people who were on ground with them, and obviously in a very easier accessible way. If you've been reading like me, I was reading The Economist in London for years, right? And every when they did the big edition, you'd have pages and pages and pages on China, pages on UK, and then Africa would have that little light blue column in the corner, and then they will use two data points, GDP, and then elections. Those were the things. So you have that
Inflation.
I guess coverage, and there's like Africa section covered.
Yeah. Inflation.
If you even look at staffing, right, you can have one correspondent looking across the entire market, and they can't do any depth. You're going to go to a market and take you might even just end up optimizing for what people want to hear about. So you see analysis on Africa, and I like the creative economy, right? But I think that we are underappreciating, the depth of our market. When we look at Africa and we say, oh, the biggest export is culture and entertainment, right? I think it's too easy. And then you
Yeah.
say, okay, we just did this Netflix movie, so that's evidence there's culture. There's activity happening in financial services, in consumer goods, in
Yeah.
energy, agriculture. There's like so much depth there, but that isn't easy to pull out, or is difficult. Like the kind of innovation happening in agribusiness, or not even innovation. Let me just say the work being done in agribusiness year after year after year is so under-recorded and underappreciated. But it's easy for someone coming to do their, let's say, their annual story on Africa. You're gonna just write on Dangote. You're just going to do it. You're just going to say, Dangote, the next thing, the refinery are done. to, move on to Kenya and talk about M-Pesa, and you have very superficial. So I think when you have locals, we're not as overly hyped by those things because we're seeing so many different things every day, and
Yeah.
so that whole perspective I think is important to actually shape everything. I'll stop here so I don't
No,
say
but
so.
I just want to add something on this that I think is a real issue, is that the African or Nigerian economists who have voices often are too wedded to the kind of neoclassical or orthodox economics they've learned at school. So they
Yeah.
go abroad to do their PhD, and then maybe they go University of Toronto or Imperial College or Oxford or Harvard, and then they come back and they want to kind of use what they were taught in a I don't mean this negatively, but in a little bit too of a rote way, and they lecture people on these kind of concepts. And I think, I had the luxury because I always been a little bit unorthodox in the position I had. We could write things when I was at PwC about the Nigerian economy from on the ground what was happening in Nigeria. So, for example, the last paper we wrote before I retired was about really very critical of this narrative that says that Nigeria or Africa should go through the same kind of economic stages as South Korea or China in terms of starting with low-end manufacturing, kind of going up the value chain over time on that. And we just said that made absolutely no sense for Nigeria. In fact, Nigeria, because of its unique skills and capabilities and challenges, also because of the unique time of technology, could insert itself directly into global value chains through this remote work. And I think it was Abdul who said, there are more programmers in Nigeria than Sweden because they're all not necessarily working for Nigerian companies, they're working abroad. And this is just exploding. And we were the first ones to kind of write that. It's now economic policy with His Excellency the Vice President leading it for the country. But I think that I would like to see the Nigerian economists and the African economists be bolder about what they write without having to stick to because the orthodoxy doesn't work. It's been kind of disproved time and time again. It worked for a narrow period of a few decades, kind of 1950 to 1980. But it's not the way economies actually work. So I'd just like the economists to be a little bit bolder and be prepared to challenge it. As I said, I was in a unique position. I could do that. I'd like to see the younger Nigerian economists do it now.
I agree. I think that also talks about how we are able to even shape and report on our own data, right? You had mentioned that we are still in the early ages when it comes to Africa, and Yele had commented that maybe right now, like looking at the US and some of these other countries, it's been hundreds of years in the making, and he says that some of us won't be around in 1,000 years, so maybe that's why the frustration to want to see it all happen now. But yeah, there's a question here from Dami. I think I'm going to throw it at Andrew. And he said, "Hi everyone. Key question for Preston and Andrew: how can macro data be supported by academia, especially in Africa? There's quite a bit of know-how that the academics have, and their presence on the continent also gives them a lot of local context. But it appears there's a disconnect between academia and commercial or macro data. How can this be bridged?" I think it's a bit about what you were already speaking on, so I wanted to add that question to it.
Yeah, it's just to be honest, I'm not really sure. It was one thing I really noticed in Nigeria that the academic economists who are very well trained and are spread through different top universities of the country didn't have much of a voice in terms
Mm.
of practical economic affairs. So, I mean, we all knew the economists that were, at least in my time there, that were kind of vocal. And you've got Bismarck, who was the most prominent among them. And, Bismarck's fantastic, but you didn't hear enough voices from academic economists. So I don't know the answer, but I would really like to see that more, them contributing to the economic debate.
Mm. But if you look at even academia now, you do a lot of research work, right? Do you think that it has improved in the way we even do research in understanding our own economy ourselves? Because there are some locally grown economists, I guess, probably still taught with the same foreign principles.
Well, I'll go back to what I said before. I think sometimes they're not innovative enough in the way they do it. They're kind of wedded to the traditional orthodox models. And I don't think they're necessarily using big data. Like the younger economists should be using these alternative data sources than to the
Mm.
traditional macroeconomic indicators. And then I think they'd get a lot more interesting insights.
Into it, yes, yes. I think that's
I,
also what
I
Preston.
was going to add something just on academia, mainly because we have gone through hiring and we have hired, economists, locally. And I mean, you face different challenges, but I think one of the things that we still have to deal with just through our own academic institutions, right, is that application layer. But I don't I can't always understand why what Andrew mentioned around their contribution to practical issue. But when we're sort of dealing with again the sort of younger economists, right, it's translating some of what you've learned into the real world. And like the fact that data is messy, it's not clean, right? If you've been taught a couple of theories, right, like Andrew mentioned, right, and you don't go through the process of critically assessing them, then when you are asked to kind of use them, you don't have that room to do the extra analysis to even say this doesn't make sense. Because I find that it's a point of you need a point of knowledge or confidence, right, to actually look at something that is well established that so many people do and say that doesn't add up. Andrew, you find your team might be able to do it, but the problem solving, the thinking, all of that, you need to actually build it. And
Well, and also, the reason that I could do it with a team is I spent 35 years in the private sector, so I had
yeah.
I had kind of some real world experience. I think it's hard to do from purely within the academia.
Academia.
Yeah, I think that really is. So the more these economists I guess get to work and get to see and get to interact with the real
Real life.
economy, do all of that, yeah, the easier it is to bring that back to work, and you see a number like this doesn't make sense, right? Because this is not how it works versus what the sort of theory says.
I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know I think Abdul always reaches out to me when you guys are hiring, and it's quite an interesting journey. He has told me some schools, I wouldn't mention the name, in Nigeria, that once you guys see graduates from there, it's like almost an immediate hire because they bring out quality. But let me not mention the name. But I know that it's an interesting process, like finding the right people.
Please don't give away my cheat codes.
Let me not give it out. Let me not give it out.
Yes, please.
There's a question here from Shegun, and he says, "What are some good data points or proxies for understanding the economic potential and making the investment case? Since we all agree that macro indicators aren't sufficient, Preston mentioned something about investment returns across asset class, but what data points can give more insights into that in Africa, capital market returns over the years?" Preston, do you want to build on that? Because you had mentioned it in the beginning, especially looking at the data that you track across exits and investments.
Yeah, should I take that or is Abdul taking that? Just checking. Okay.
I think you could take it.
Okay, all right. So it's just breaking a little bit, but I'll go on. I think you can hear me. So I mean, when we talk about in investment data, and I think this is actually what Abdul, this is the team that Abdul leads at Stears, right? You're looking at basics. So we focus on fund managers, right? And what the fund managers typically look at, maybe they're looking at IRR, they're looking at multiple on invested capital, because you put in $1 today, you're getting it out. Well, hopefully, if you get an exit, right, 5 to 10 years, and 5 to 10 years later, and you're getting X or Y, right? I think the exit data is really just how much did you put in first time, account for some of the important things like the valuation, was it dollar investment or naira investment, right? And just see how much you actually took out. So it's not necessarily NGX returns or the all share index growth. I mean, I think those are interesting macro one, but I tend to trust more deal level data. And you can start to look at perhaps sector returns, right? So if you're looking at 10 investments in financial services over the last year, and you're looking at 10 investments in, let me say, agriculture, energy, right? And you're looking at sort of average dollar spent, you're looking at the returns on those investments when people were taking their money, right? That tends to give you a much stronger sense of how that sector is actually doing from a returns perspective. Because it's one thing for companies in a space to actually make money, right? It's another thing for them to make enough money to return capital or return investment, to their investors. Because one challenge we still face in different parts of the continent is exit. So the investors will now say, deploying money is not that hard. Take $1 million, fine. Right? Getting it back, I think that's that's a trick. So can you get it back in a good timeline? Are you going to get it back in 15 years? Or are you going to get it back in 3 years? Right? So those are the kind of specific data point. And then you can even look at the fund manager level as well, right? And say, these are the funds investing, right? What are the distributions to their LPs? What do they going to look like? Right, because again, the money is ultimately coming from the LPs, going to the GP all the way to the into the company. So I think those are important things. That's why perhaps in the tech ecosystem you hear big competition around exits, right? Where are the exits? Because if there are no exits, then it means that people are sitting on positions and assets that they can't liquidate, they can't get out. So are there secondary markets, right? Are there other markets where people are just getting out of the assets? I think those are the actual things to look at. We all call it transaction data, because effectively the sub attributes that tell you a lot more about what's really happening, or at least what has definitely.
Awesome. I want to actually go down a bit on that. And Abdul, I'm going to throw this to you. I want you to give us some sneak peek into some of the data that you have. Because Preston has mentioned different sectors. So we want the expo right now. So based off of what you're seeing, right, are there any specific emerging trends across sectors or any interesting like data points that you guys have seen recently that you'd like to share with us? Give us the expo now.
Well, I think what it is obviously just, and even at a more higher level, understanding which sectors are particularly still interesting when it comes to investments and activity or traction. Obviously, I think like many who already probably know from all the press releases and media announcements, fintech will still remain a very core part of many African economies. I think fundamentally it's just that fact for us is that mobile money has become so wedded into the ecosystem in terms of how people carry out digital payments. So across Africa, I think I mentioned Francophone Africa being sort of like one of the interesting places. And I think Francophone Africa, what makes it also interesting is not a lot of competition. So there's obviously a natural first mover advantage. I can say that because I don't plan to open a fintech in Francophone Africa anytime soon. So you guys can have that one for free. I think another one is, I think in the logistics and e-commerce, I think it's estimated to be about 40 billion by the end of this year. And it's interesting because I think a lot of companies had got burnt in the past from the last mile delivery, so figuring out supply chains, delivery services, warehousing. But there is actually quite a lot of opportunity when you start to think about things like cross-border freight, cold storage. Because, for instance, to trade certain goods effectively, you need cold storage. There's a massive gap in that market that we've seen sort of investors being particularly interested in terms of who can deliver that effectively. I think India has been a model that some countries have also used because that was actually government subsidized investment into the industry to essentially grow that cold storage market. But I think with the AFCFTA, that I think, as Andrew mentioned, is probably going to boost inter-African trade and also demand over the next few years. Another one is actually, before I forget, super important one, digital infrastructure upswing. As we mentioned at the beginning, obviously the Africa's sort of digital backbone is expanding, particularly in the tech infrastructure. So when you think about data centers, fiber cables, and I think one thing I, for instance, see a lot of conversations around is something called like data sovereignty, which is that many countries don't want to host their data in another market. And there's a big opportunity there to be plugged around just actually fulfilling that demand for various countries. Even beyond the data sovereignty conversation, I think we've seen that with the advancements in AI tools and LLMs, there is just a massive shortfall in energy, data center capacity to actually run a lot of the computation required to support the access to a wider base of users. So I think that is projected to reach maybe 10 billion by 2028 in just Africa. And right now, I think Africa only hosts about 1% of the world's data center capacity, with 70% of the world's population. So again, massive interesting sort of gap there. Last thing I'll just mention is I think beyond the usual suspects, as I mentioned, energy is going to continue to be a very important one, whether it's like solar grids and also sort of trying to sort of build capacity to either meet shortfall in energy or replace capacity with sort of cleaner energy sources as well.
So those are insights. I hope you guys are taking notes because I feel like that is a sneak peek into some of the data that's available, and that's very insightful. We are even past time, and I just want to appreciate everyone for coming. I want to take very quick, like 30 seconds final comments from the guests. We'll start with Andrew, Preston, then Abdul. 30 seconds. Final comments.
No, I mean, I remain very optimistic about Nigeria and Africa, and I think, as I said a little earlier, that people should be incredibly pleased with the amazing progress. I mean, a little bit from the outside now, you can continue to see this. So keep going, Africa, and it's fantastic. And the world is shifting demographically. There's no choice. Africa is going to be rising, no matter whether people outside Africa want it or not. So go, Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think what I'll just say is to a big trend that we hear around sort of risk and African uncertainty, just doing business in there. I think that where data can come in is helping to turn some of that uncertainty into risk. I know it sounds very similar, but risk can be priced, and once you can price it, then you can sort of estimate. You can work with it in a way that's comfortable for the investment process, right? So I think moving from a place where we think of everything as uncertain, we use data better. We're willing to dig a bit deeper. I think we just then have to price that risk properly and make sure we're not thinking of Africa as an uncertain environment, because when you work with locals, it's much easier to navigate some of these things. So yeah, I hope data can help us better price things so that there's more capital coming in.
Awesome. Abdul?
Great. I think mine is just maybe just like a phrase I think I remember from a documentary about a fund that was investigation for many fraud allegations, but I remember the phrase because it's very interesting, and I think was apt in the case of China, and also I think apt in the case of Africa. And it's a phrase that says, I think, muddy waters make it easy to catch fish. And essentially it is fundamentally just around the idea that actually in non-transparent markets, there is opportunity for like opportunistic behaviors to take advantage. And I think that is where, to even Andrew's other point, where we are right now, the data will eventually get there. The visibility and transparency will eventually get there. What it is essentially now is like we're in this sort of opportunistic period where you can essentially take advantage and basically be a first mover by just being more nuanced and essentially trying to capture and gather more information before you make a decision.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been an honor hosting you guys. Thank you for the insights that you've shared. And like I said earlier, this session is brought to you by Tana. We're going to keep having sessions like this because we feel that it's our job to educate people on what doing business in Africa really, really is. You hear from the operators, you hear from people that have done amazing work on the continent, and you get to see it. And you get to hear them talk with such passion about their work. And I feel like that is contagious. That's really, really important. And we're going to keep doing that. And if you're keen about building a business in Nigeria or in Africa, or just better understanding doing business on the continent, feel free to reach out to us at Itana. Go to itana.africa. And if you want access to data, hit the guys up at Stears. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Abdul. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Preston. You have been so wonderful, so insightful. I'm grateful. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Thank you for your questions. They're like a lot more questions that are there, but because of time, we can't really take it. But thank you so much for the questions and the insights and the energy. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Bye-bye.
Great.
Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you.